Hello everybody, GRL fan here, and you guys get to see me this time during one of my videos. I think it would be more entertaining if you guys are able to see me instead of just only listening. I know a lot of you do not have a problem with just listening to me, but I would like to, kind of improve the interactiveness of my videos. So you might be seeing me a little bit more on this channel. But today, as you can tell by the title, we're going to be talking about the Hagenbeck-Wallace circus crash yet again. Every time I come back with another Hagenbeck-Wallace video, I have new information for you. This video might not be quite as long. I don't know. I'm going to try to keep it short, but it still might end up being, a pretty significantly long video. I don't know. We'll see. Men in the Towers, Part 2. We're going to be talking about the Tolleston operator, Ed Fifield, and we're also going to be talking about the Ivanhoe operator, whose name is Hamilton Remington Forbes. Forbes was 10 years younger than Fifield during the night of the accident in 1918. Forbes had numerous male family members who worked for EJ&E. They all pretty much lived on the same street, Fairbank Street in Gary, Indiana. Alright. Forbes, he started working at Ivanhoe Tower in the last part of 1917. He was employed as the Ivanhoe operator during the night of the accident on June 22nd. Before I continue on this video, I just want to recap some things. The first thing that I want to recap is that because of the curve in the main line, neither tower operator could see each other's signals. The second point that I want to recap is both tower operators had perfect views of the south side of both the circus train and the troop train, which were the trains involved in the wreck, of course. Yet because the burning journal box on the circus train was on the north side of the circus train, neither the tower operator at Ivanhoe or Tolleston could see the burning journal box, thus could not inform the circus train of a problem. At about 3:44 a.m., Fifield, who was the tower operator at Tolleston, he called Hamilton Forbes at Ivanhoe to inform him that the second part of the circus train had just passed its position. At about 3:52 a.m., Fifield called Forbes again to tell him that the troop train had just passed its position. And it was at this time that Forbes asked Fifield questions about proper lever position, which is, a very bad time, to ask some questions about what you're supposed to be doing. And we're going to get into that later on in the video. Forbes should have told Fifield that the circus train had stopped on the main line, but he wouldn't have known the reason why. As I said, he couldn't see the burning journal box, so there would be no reason for Forbes to believe that there was an emergency. His only problem was he was having trouble trying to figure out how to handle all of these trains that were coming. And once again, we're going to get into that a little bit later. During the phone call, it is unknown if Forbes mentioned that the circus train had stopped on the main line, as I previously stated, and he was cutting it very close. As I said, not only was the circus train and the troop train in danger of collision at any moment, there were other trains that were stopped on the EJ&E line and on the Michigan Central line. Well, what I should say is that there were trains that were stopped, and then there were trains that were going to be stopped, once they got into range of the jurisdiction of Ivanhoe Tower. Forbes would have been under great pressure to perform his task correctly and to ensure that all trains pass safely across his interlocking under his jurisdiction. If he was having problems with, proper lever positioning or what to do or whatever sequence he should go first or whatever the case may be, he called the Tolleston operator and asked him for some pointers, for some tips. It's not known how urgent this call was. It's not known, exactly what Fifield told Forbes during this phone call. But it was right in that period of time where the circus train had stopped and when the troop train was passing Tolleston. So in that little window of time there, that is when this phone call took place. So while the trains were gaining on one another, the tower operators were having a conversation about what to do as far as the levers, and I would imagine who's going to be going first, who's going to be stopping, and whatnot. And I don't know if Fifield had any experience working at Tolleston Tower. He was a Michigan Central employee, but the tower was an EJ&E tower at Ivanhoe. So I don't know exactly what arrangements that Michigan Central and EJ&E had as far as Ivanhoe Tower and their employees. I do know that some tower operators rotated between towers sometimes. So it wouldn't surprise me if, sometimes Ivanhoe operators worked at the Tolleston Tower, or sometimes the Tolleston Tower people worked at Ivanhoe. I'm really not sure how all of that works together, but it intrigues me. I really want to know what Forbes asked Fifield during this conversation. I really want to know, really bad. The next point that I want to make is that at 3:55 a.m., the circus train stopped 70 feet short of the interlocking on the Gary and Western Industrial Track. At this time, the troop train would have been clearing the curve and coming into view of the circus train crew and Forbes in Ivanhoe Tower. Forbes did set the signal correctly, but it's unknown if he actually set the signals in time for the troop train to see the signals, which wouldn't have mattered anyway because Alonzo Sargent, who was the pilot of the oncoming troop train, was asleep at the throttle. And it's unknown what his fireman was doing, but he was probably asleep as well. Or, maybe it was just this seniority thing where he didn't want to overstep his boundaries and bother Sargent while he slept, and he just watched Sargent sleep, and didn't do anything to prevent the crash. I don't know what his fireman was doing. It's really hard to nail it down. But ultimately, the fireman didn't do anything to prevent the crash. The wreck occurred at 3:58 a.m. between Stevenson Street and Holbert Street in the city of Gary, Indiana, in the Ivanhoe neighborhood. The reason why I talk so much about the men in the towers is because they were the only witnesses to events leading up to the crash, and they were the ones that were on the outside during the crash itself. The tower men were also the first point of contact to the rest of the world. What they experienced and what they saw was just important as what the survivors experienced and saw. And I want to understand as much of the full picture as possible. The reason why I do so many videos about this wreck is because it is local history, and of course because it is local history, I am very interested in it. However, it's more to it than that to me. There were so many failures. Many failures. Everyone likes to point the finger at Alonzo Sargent. Indeed, his role in this case is extremely significant. Yet I believe there is more to this story than Alonzo Sargent. There are so many things that have not been covered, or that have been talked about but brushed over, or just completely ignored and buried. The suppression of evidence was so complete that even today, in today's information age, it's hard to really research the particular detail of the case other than what's already known on a wider scale in the books and in the newspapers that we all have access to. Alonzo Sargent makes a very convincing scapegoat. He dug a pretty big hole for himself. There is no doubt that he was asleep at the throttle. We got that. I'm not trying to defend Alonzo Sargent, but we're going to get back to why This video is more like a conspiracy theory video. I'm playing devil's advocate with some of the details and some of the facts, and I'm really just trying to figure out how all of these failures occurred, because it was not just all on Alonzo Sargent. I want to talk about other employees that worked at the towers. Hamilton Forbes, who was the operator at Ivanhoe Tower. He was pretty new at his job. I mentioned at the end of my last video that there was a wreck earlier in 1918 at Ivanhoe, February 25th, 1918 to be exact. A westbound Michigan Central coal train derailed right at Ivanhoe Interlocking, spilling coal all over the place, tearing up the tracks, damaging the coal hoppers, and just really creating a big ass mess. There were no injuries, there were no deaths, but it happened in pretty much at the same time of mourning as the Hagenbeck-Wallace crash 4 months later in June, within the 3 o'clock hour train. I offered a theory in my last video that Forbes could have been on duty the night of this coal train derailment as well, but there is no evidence of that. That is just pure speculation on my part. I spent a lot of time trying to hunt down those who worked at Ivanhoe Tower during 1918, people who could have been employed at the tower during the time of a circus crash. And I did it just to get a full picture of what it would be like to work in that tower during that time, and just to see what different personalities were there, and see how the shifts could have been, manipulated between this person or that person during the time of an accident. One of the men that I found, his name was Cleo Dutton. He started working at Ivanhoe Tower in 1915, and he was employed at Ivanhoe Tower at the time of the Hagenbeck-Wallace crash. Mr. Dutton was killed by the police in 1921, which is a story that has nothing to do with the Hagenbeck-Wallace crash, so I'm not even going to cover it. But I just thought, for people who like to deep dive, look up Cleo Dutton and find out what happened to that guy. Another man who worked at Ivanhoe Tower was a man who went by the name D.W. Sweet. Mr. Sweet actually lived on Fairbank Street, which was right around the corner from Ivanhoe Tower. Fairbank Street was also the street that Hamilton Forbes lived on, and he had a lot of family members who also lived on Fairbank Street at the time of the Hagenbeck-Wallace crash. I believe I pulled up a picture of the house in my previous video. I don't have that information available right now, but if you look at my previous video, I have a picture of the house that the Forbes lived in on Fairbank Street. Now, Fairbank Street technically doesn't exist anymore today. The street is overgrown, but there are still some abandoned homes in that area. If you are feeling brave enough one day, you want to hack through the trees and the weeds and shit, you want to see what's still back there. I'm pretty sure that some of those houses are still standing, but pretty much Fairbank Street has been completely changed and then completely abandoned. But Hobart Street and Stevenson Street still exist. There's still homes there. There's still people that live there. So just be careful, people. Don't go to those neighborhoods, causing a problem, causing a scene, lurking around there. Don't go to those streets. There is not an active neighborhood, but, people live there. They mind their own business. I'm pretty sure they know about the circus crash. There's probably a lot of people that go to those streets, often throughout the year. But don't go bothering those people that live there. Okay, don't tell them that GI fan sent you, because I didn't. There was another Forbes family member that worked at Ivanhoe Tower as well. I don't know if he worked with Hamilton Forbes. I don't even know this other Forbes name, but I do suspect that there was another person named Forbes who worked at that tower, who also lived on Fairbank Street and was probably a relative of Hamilton Forbes. I also offered the theory that Hamilton Forbes, being as young as he was, He probably got that tower operator job at Ivanhoe through his family, because his family members were all EJ&E employees, mostly, pretty much mechanics and engineers and signalmen and towermen and things of that nature. It would probably have been very easy for Hamilton Forbes to get this job. Now, was he qualified for this job? Was he motivated for this job? Did he do the absolute best job that he could at the job? It's to be debated. I think that Hamilton Forbes was a young man who, didn't know what the hell he was doing when it came to that job, and he was the type of guy that probably folded under pressure. We'll touch on this a little bit later. I want to keep going real quick. Finally, there was a man named Strauss. I have not found out a first name for him, but he was a veteran railroad employee, worked for EJ&E, and he worked at Ivanhoe Tower prior to 1913. So just goes to show you, how long this man had been working, at least at that tower. And he was employed at Ivanhoe Tower during the time of the Hagenbeck-Wallace crash. I'm not exactly sure the exact date when EJ&E crossed the Michigan Central at Ivanhoe. I want to say it was 1906, 1907-ish. Really not sure. I know there's some of you guys that would know that better than I. The interlocking at Ivanhoe was not that old by the time 1913 come around. What was interesting about Mr. Strauss and the year 1913 was Mr. Strauss was robbed at work while he worked at the Ivanhoe Tower. I thought it was pretty, got a good chuckle out of me. Somebody put a rock inside of a switch stand, and when Strauss tried to move the switch in the tower, the switch wouldn't budge. So he left the tower to go investigate the switch. He was trying to throw the switch. I guess there was a train coming, and he couldn't throw the switch. He discovered that there was a rock inside of the box, and I don't think he reported it, or didn't want to report it. He just took the rocks out of the box and got the switch back working, and he returned to the tower. But once he returned to the tower, he found that he was locked out of it. So he kicked the door in, and once he entered the tower again, he realized he had been robbed. Somebody had stole all his guns. Apparently he kept a cache of guns in the tower with him, and they also took a bunch of personal things, probably money, maybe some jewelry or something. They didn't really say what those personal things were, but they did say that he had a whole cache of guns. It was gone, all of it. So when he left to go, fix the switch, somebody got him. And that happened in 1913. So, Mr. Strauss was employed during the time of the Hagenback-Wallace crash in 1918 at Ivanhoe Tower. It just goes to show you some of the names of the people, and it just goes to show you it wasn't just Hamilton Forbes that was working in that tower. It was a whole shift of people, that had access to that tower as far as being employees. Makes me question Hamilton Forbes even more. As far as the coal train crash in February of 1918, any of those guys could have been on duty that night. The newspaper article that I read did not state the name of the person who was in charge of Ivanhoe Tower that night when the derailment occurred. It really doesn't even say what the cause of the derailment was. Considering the time of night that it happened, the only other person who worked that late at night at Ivanhoe Tower that was mentioned anywhere in any publication, and the only name that is associated with any kind of wreck or accident at Ivanhoe at any point in time, there's only one name, and that's Hamilton Forbes. Now we're going to be getting into my conspiracy. And what my conspiracy is based on things that are not there. It's based on things that have not been talked about. It's based on things that cannot be found. So what the hell am I talking about? Maybe you guys can try to follow along, and it has everything to do with Hamilton Forbes. Now this is my opinion, okay? And it may not move you, some of you, one way or another. But I'm going to try to state a case. And if it makes sense to you, I want you to leave comments and, discuss it down below. And, try to, use educated guesses and educated theories to try to figure out what exactly was going on that night or any night prior to and afterwards. My opinion is Remington Forbes, the tower operator at Ivanhoe during the time of the Hagenbeck-Wallace crash, messed up the lever positions at some point between 3:50 a.m. and the time of the crash at 3:58 a.m. on July 22nd, 1918. June 22nd, 1918, excuse me. And I wonder, could his fumbling around with the levers that night have a significant impact on the events that occurred on that night? Specifically with where the circus train stopped. The locomotive stopped 70 feet short of the Gary and Western. Now, I got this ready for you, so I'm going to bring this up. What I have here is a cartographic map of the Gary and Western, which is the entire Gary and West, just the Gary and Western portion between Ivanhoe and Gary and Western Junction, which is on the east side of Broadway. Now, right where the new connection connected with the old CINS connection, which, we're not going to talk about that right now because the accident didn't happen. The accident didn't happen in that location. But what you see in front of you right now is the cartographic map, and I'll show you the year. You see down here, it says Gary and Western Railroad corrected for land only. Land shows as of June 30, 1917, which is a very important year because this means that this was almost exactly a year before the Hagenbeck-Wallace crash. So everything that you see in this cartographic map is the Gary and Western as it was, probably during 1918 as well. I don't suspect that things changed all that much. Let's dig down into it, and I'm gonna not talk about anything that is unrelated to the crash. Now we are zoomed in, and what are we zoomed in on? We are zoomed in on Ivanhoe. You see the big old white letters down there that says Ivanhoe. Alright, so we're at Ivanhoe Interlocking, and what we're looking at the top of the page, the top of the video is north, bottom is south, the left side is west, the right side is east. Alright, now the main line for the Michigan Central Railroad is here, and you can see these two white lines here. These show you the eastbound and the westbound mainline tracks on the Michigan Central here. The westbound track will be the track that is north, which is this thin white line here, and the eastbound track is under it, south. But both of these run east and west, alright? So you railroaders, you know what I'm talking about. This doesn't show you where Ivanhoe Tower sat. Ivanhoe Tower sat right where I'm circling the mouse, alright? Right there at that southwest corner of the Ivanhoe Interlocking, alright? And there was a switch plant in there, had over 24 switches and things of that nature. Now this map doesn't show you everything that was in the area, alright? It just shows you the main components of the interlocking. Alright, so any siding tracks or any leads that go to any businesses or any landmarks, things that are not related to Gary and Western, on a basic level, they're not shown on these cartographic maps. Just the most important information, which is good enough for my purposes right now. Got these two lines here, and you really can't really make out the really thin white line, but that is the westbound main line. Okay? that is the track that both the Circus train and the Troop train were traveling upon when the accident occurred. All right. So this thicker white line under it, that is the eastbound main. All right. You can see that there are a number of crossover tracks between the eastbound and the westbound main lines here. That's this thick line here that's kind of diagonal here. And then there's another crossover track between the westbound main line and the Gary and Western. All right. So the Gary and Western in this is highlighted in between these thick white boundary lines here, which shows you the parcels that are owned by the Gary and Western Railroad Company. So anything that is inside of the Gary and Western Railroad Company's jurisdiction is bordered by these thick white lines, and the Gary and Western will be located right in the middle of it. Alright, so if I were to show you this on the Google Maps, or Google Earth I should say, you'll see that the interlocking, doesn't look the same way as it does on the cartographic map here. There are no double track main lines on the Michigan Central anymore. It's just a single track, as you can see here. Just a single track, and the crossover from the Michigan Central main line to the Gary and Western main line has been extended, straightened out, and it's a lot steeper than here, as you can see what it looked like in 1917. If you're trying to understand the dynamics of the crash, you cannot use the current configuration of the trackage between the old Michigan Central line, which is now the CSX Porter branch, and the Gary and Western line. You can't use that because that's inaccurate. The Circus train was not parked on this long siding here. Alright, so if you are amongst those who think that the Circus train was parked there, it was not. Completely different track configuration. This was the track configuration of in 1917. So what's going on here in this cartographic map is that if you go back just a little bit, you see this street. Back then, Colfax Street was called Englewood Street, or Englewood Avenue, I should say. All right, so this is Colfax Street. All right, Colfax did not exist, I don't believe, in 1917 or 1918. It was called Englewood Street, or Englewood Avenue, I should say. I keep calling this street. It's Englewood Avenue. Englewood Street is around where Oscar Tim threw the lantern at the troop train. But the accident itself occurred a little bit west of this street here, in between Englewood Street, or what is today Colfax Street, and the former crossover track between the east and westbound main line of the Michigan Central, and the crossover track between the westbound main line and the Gary and Western. So where was the Circus train? The Circus train was parked 70 feet from the Interlocking, which is this yellow line here. That's the middle of the Interlocking. All right. I mean, do you see, about right here, the locomotive was on the Gary and Western itself, which is this thick line here, and the rest of the train was on the crossover track. So if you come here, you come down here, boom. All right. So this thin white line here is where the Circus train was parked, and the rest of the train was on this crossover track. Well, more accurately, I should say, the last 4 cars was on the westbound main line. All right. And the rest of the train was parked on the crossover. and the locomotive was the only part of the train that was actually on the Gary and Western, 70 feet from the middle of the interlocking. If you want to know more information about my theories about what happened here, you can watch my other videos. But right now, I want to focus on something very specific. Why did the engineer of the Circus train stop his locomotive 70 feet from the interlocking? Why didn't the engineer cross the interlocking and stop his train so that the caboose was 70 feet beyond the interlocking? Why wasn't the caboose parked here on the Gary and Western, which is not on the main line of the Michigan Central? Why instead was the caboose parked on the main line of the Michigan Central instead of up here? This is my conspiracy. My conspiracy theory is that Hamilton Forbes completely screwed up something between 3:50 a.m. and 3:58 a.m. It is known that when Fifield, who was the operator at Tolleston Tower, called Forbes, when Fifield called Forbes and informed him that the first part of the troop train had passed his position, which was Alonzo Sargent's train, Forbes began to ask questions about proper lever settings with Fifield at that time during that conversation. And I want to know so bad what that conversation was. I found nothing that stated exactly, what was said, or even a paraphrasing of what was said. All I know is that Forbes asked Fifield questions about proper lever positioning, proper lever settings. Why would a tower operator who's supposed to know his job ask another tower operator how to set his levers? I suspect Hamilton Forbes messed up his lever positions between 3:50 and 3:58, which was the time of the crash. Could his fumbling around with the levers have caused the circus train to stop short of the interlocking? That has always bothered me, and I'm sure this has bothered some of you as well. Why the hell did the engineer of the circus train stop short of the interlocking instead of crossing the interlocking? Now, here's some more information for you. There were trains that were already stopped on the EJ&E main line, and there were trains that were either stopped or being prepared to be stopped on the Michigan Central main line. And we're talking about trains that are stopped coming both from the north and the south on the EJ&E line, and from the east on the Michigan Central main line. Forbes had stopped these trains, or were getting ready to stop some of them. Some of them were stopped, some of them were not yet at the scene but were on the way. Forbes was to stop all of those freights. You had basically 3 passenger trains rocketing westbound on the Michigan Central past him, and all of these trains were right behind each other. In order to facilitate safe passage, it would make sense to me if you had freights that were also scheduled to cross the interlocking at the same time. You would probably want to stop the freights before they arrived at the interlocking, then allow for the circus train and both of the troop trains to pass the interlocking safely. And once all of those trains pass, then you would allow the freights to come through based on, priority or the order that they arrived or whatever the case may be. But you would want those passenger trains, to, come through and cross the interlocking, first. At least that's what I would think. Normally, freights would have priority. But in this particular situation, with it being troop trains, and during the war, World War I was taking place at this time. Those troop trains, even though they were empty, probably had a lot of priority. So, and the circus train would just benefit from that. Another thing about the circus train is that circus train was to come off of the main line anyway and get onto the Gary and Western. With those particular orders, it really wouldn't have mattered how quick or how close the troop trains were behind the circus train, because at the time where all of them were to be at Ivanhoe, the circus train was supposed to already be off the main line and onto the Gary and Western. The circus train should not have encountered or interacted with any of the troop trains that were coming behind it at all. But of course, as we know, it did interact with one of those troop trains, which was Alonzo Sargent's train, which was the train that crashed into the end of the circus train. The way that the orders were given out, that was not supposed to happen. Yes, there was a burning journal box. These are veteran crews working, the circus train. I'm pretty sure this is not their first burning journal box that they've had to deal with. Yes, stopping the train to address that burning journal box is important. To stop the train, cool off the journal box, re-oil it, repack it, whatever you're gonna do, keep the train moving. Sure, but was it so important? Was it so drastic that the engineer of the circus train had no choice but to stop that locomotive where he did, 70 feet short of the interlocking? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me, especially if the journal box wasn't spotted until after the train passed Tolleston, or maybe right before the train passed Tolleston. It was a gap between when the conductors or the brakemen hung the lantern up on the back of the caboose to inform the engineers at the front of the train that there was a journal box burning. There was a gap between that and the engineers actually seeing that lantern. So once the engineer seen the lantern, he was already traveling very fucking slow anyway. He slowed the train down even more, and then the train was going to slow even more because it was supposed to cross over from the westbound main line of the Michigan Central onto the Gary and Western. You can't take that at full speed, So they probably was going less than 10 miles an hour, less than 7 miles an hour probably when they were crossing over. Yes, the journal box was burning. Yes, it was a problem, but was it so much of a problem that the engineer had to stop where he stopped? I don't think so. I don't buy it. There was absolutely no reason why that circus train could not cross that interlocking that night, especially when Hamilton Forbes had already stopped the closest train that was coming on the EJ&E. It was stopped just north of 5th Avenue here, in between the South Shore tracks and 5th Avenue. There was another train coming from the south northbound that was either stopped or was preparing to stop before it reached the interlocking. And then there was an eastbound Michigan Central train, freight train, coming from the Gibson area. And I do know that train actually had stopped before it got to Ivanhoe. So it was in the Gibson area. That particular train, that eastbound Michigan Central train, was in the Gibson area and had stopped. Hadn't even arrived to that area during the time of the crash. That train actually was in that area or in the Ivanhoe block after the crash. There was no reason for, that circus train to have stopped where it did. It was almost like they wanted that damn train to be destroyed. And there's no way that engineer of the circus train didn't know that his ass was on the main line. Like, these are seasoned crews. They can count cars in between signals and know if they cut in too many cars or cut in too few. They know which passing sidings they can take and what they can't take based on the number of cars that they have. They can count it in the dark. They can do it in their head. It's second nature. They don't even need pen and paper. I just don't buy that. Just on his own volition, on his own say-so, on his own authority, that the engineer had to stop the train where he did. Something else was going on that caused the engineer to stop that train where he did. And this is just speculation, but I'm trying to use some common sense here. The night was cold, but it wasn't raining. It wasn't snowing. It's June. It's summertime. Yeah, sometimes it can get cold. And it was cold on the night of the crash. The only reason or the only thing that could stop that circus train from crossing that interlocking was if the circus train was told to stop there. Even though the journal box was burning and the engineer knew it still is not reason enough, especially for how slow the train was moving. There's no reason why that train had to stop where it did. You know, if anybody want to challenge me on that, feel free, but this is my opinion. I think the circus train had plenty of room, plenty of time, you know, plenty of authority to actually cross the Ivanhoe Interlocking and get the train all the way onto the Gary and Western tracks and then stop. And it could stay there all day or all night if it wanted to, because it's off the main line. The Gary and Western was a pretty busy industrial track, but it was nowhere as busy as the Michigan Central main line. And it would have been just fine, and the circus train, the troop trains could have passed 3 seconds behind it, and it wouldn't have made any difference at all whatsoever. But that's not what happened. What happened was the circus train stopped short of the interlocking. That allowed a situation for the troop trains to be in danger of colliding with it. And it's my speculation that it was Hamilton Forbes' inability to handle the pressure of the situation that he was in. And he fumbled the levers and accidentally told that circus train to stop where it did. That's the only thing that makes sense to me. That's the only thing that makes sense. And there's no reason why that couldn't have happened, y'all. I just can't see it. Not in the middle of the night, not with relatively clear weather. Yes, it was cold and windy, but it was not raining. It was not foggy. You know, it was just cold. You know, hey, you know, this is the Midwest. It can get goddamn cold up here, even in June. I just can't see a reason why. Like, I've read the accident reports. I've read them a million times. And it still doesn't make any sense to me, man. It still does not make any type of sense to me whatsoever. All right, look, imagine everything prior to the crash happened exactly like it did in real life. But once the circus train got to Ivanhoe, it actually crossed the interlocking. That would have left the main line, the Michigan Central main line, the westbound main, completely open. It would allow for both of those troop trains to pass by incident-free. Can you imagine if that had happened? If both of the troop trains passed, even if Alonzo was asleep at the throttle? Still, maybe that his train would have still been in an accident, but maybe he hit a man in downtown Hammond or something. Crushed him up real good, and he didn't know it. He was asleep when it happened, and the train kept on going and never stopped. That might have made the paper. But as far as history is concerned, that would have been nowhere near important. You know how many people been hit by trains back then and was reported? Nobody remembers that shit. Nobody cares. People like me are the only one who give a damn, and that's only just to document it data-wise. I'm not even thinking about the people being killed. Oh well, the train won. You know what I'm saying? But imagine if the circus train actually had crossed the interlocking. At the time that it did, everything happened exactly the same. And that's the only difference. The circus train crossed the interlocking. This accident would have never happened. There's something else that I want to talk about here. There are other towers on the Michigan Central main line in Gary, and none of the narratives from these other smaller towers have been documented. The same as Hamilton Forbes' account of his activities during the night of the crash. That has not been documented, or if it has never been released to the public. Never. Between Tolleston and Ivanhoe, there were at least 2 watchtowers or 2 sentry towers or shanties. One was at Taft Street. I know that for certain. And there was one at Chase Street. These smaller shanties, these shacks, there were, just street crossing gates, the railroad gates. That's what they controlled on those streets. And they also controlled the switching mechanisms that allowed trains to switch cars in and out of different businesses along those main lines. Like, you guys, the Michigan Central main line in Gary was a very dynamic line, busy back then, and there was a lot of shit going on that line on a daily basis. You had lumber yards, you had coal yards, you had breweries, you had manufacturing, you had all kinds of other shit, and shit was being switched on and off of those leads and sidings on a daily basis. Even at night, there's a lot of atmosphere to this story, that gets lost in the sauce of the tragedy of, the deaths and all of that, which is fine. I'm not really expecting people to be like me and wanting to know every goddamn thing about it. The devil is in the details. These smaller towers, the accounts from whoever these guys were that were working that night in these places, they were never documented. They're not even in the ICC accident report. These little watchtowers between Tolleston and Ivanhoe, they were completely ignored. What did they see? I want to know what they saw during that time of the accident. Just because they worked the gates, you know what I'm saying? Oh shit, we don't want to talk to them. I would expect for an accident of this caliber, every T would be crossed and every I would be dotted. But maybe every T was crossed and every I was dotted, but we weren't meant to see that. You know what I'm saying? And it really makes me suspicious that the tower operator at Tolleston, his account is not found anywhere. Why is that? I think the railroad covered up his fuck up. I have absolutely no evidence that this occurred. I'm not saying that this absolutely happened. I have no proof, but I have a suspicion. And just based on what I'm looking at and based on what I've been reading, Hamilton Forbes fucked up that night. Why would they let it out why would that come out that, Hamilton Forbes asks Ed Fifield and Tolleston about lever positions just a few minutes before the accident? Maybe it was innocent and maybe, it was not a significant conversation. That is always possible, and I will concede that. That is always possible. But what if it wasn't just simply that? What if Hamilton Forbes fucked up and for some reason he made that circus train stop where it did, and it left that circus train's ass out on the main line? If everything, even if that had happened, let's say, okay, Hamilton Forbes fucked up. He made the fucking train stop and it wasn't supposed to stop where it did. This is where Alonzo Sargent's fuck up comes into play. So it's like a fuck up on top of a fuck up. But Alonzo Sargent's fuck up is easy to make a scapegoat out of. He was asleep at the throttle. He admitted that he was asleep at the throttle, which is negligence beyond comprehension. He took some medication and ate a big old meal, and while he was riding in the loco, it got cold and he wanted to get warm, and he closed the window, and the combination of the kidney pills and the meal that he ate and the fatigue from the lack of sleep that he got, it all just combined right then at this moment, and the rocking of the train back and forth just put my man out. To me, that is a relatable situation. And I'm not trying to defend Alonzo Sargent. Alonzo Sargent messed up. I'm not trying to defend Alonzo. His mistake was a human mistake, but it was a mistake that cost a lot of lives. And unfortunately, he's a part of the club where one person is responsible for the deaths of over 100 just because of something very trivial. What messed Alonzo Sargent up was not only the fact that he fell asleep at the throttle, it's because he tried to hide it. He ran from the scene, and it made him look very guilty. It made him look very suspicious, and the media and the people of Northwest Indiana wanted his head on a platter. Had Alonzo Sargent stuck around and manned up and took responsibility for what he did on the day of, the reaction to what he did probably would have still been scathing, but it probably would have been a lot gentler versus what he actually did, which was leave the scene of the accident and flee and go back to Kalamazoo where he was from. He fled the scene. he was seen, at the accident manipulating the controls before he fled the scene. He was trying to make it look like he applied the brakes on the locomotive, but he never did because he was asleep. Moving off of that for a second, conspiracy theory time again. This could have been mentioned in the books. Like, I'm not really depending on the books right now, but the trial for the crash was, they tried to hide it and tried to keep the press out of it, and the press did not like that at all. Oh no. And they wanted to know, why is the trial, why is the grand jury and all this stuff being kept secret? What is going on? What is happening? Why isn't the account of Hamilton Forbes, who was the Ivanhoe Tower operator the night of the crash, why is his account not present in the media? Why is it not present in the official ICC accident report? His actions that night might have been innocent. Maybe he didn't do anything wrong. I'm thinking that he did. There's no way that I could prove it one way or another. There's no way that you can prove it one way or another. Somebody made a huge mistake that night, and it was not just Alonzo Sargent. Alright, I've rambled long enough, so you guys, you leave comments down below. You let me know, was some evidence suppressed during the trial of Alonzo Sargent? Was the railroad responsible for covering up the mistake of one of its employees, EJ&E in particular? Were the railroads negligent and not keeping track of the activities of their employees? Oh, there's one more thing. I almost forgot this. One more thing, and then I'm done. Let me read my notes here. 2 months after the Hagenbeck-Wallace wreck, the Gary Police Department got word from unknown individuals about Tolleston operators who worked the night shift. And they accused this operator, who was unnamed, of being neglectful in his duties. This particular person was known to have a habit of lowering the gates in the middle of the night when there was no train coming and going to sleep, taking cat naps for 10-20 minutes at a time, and traffic had to wait for this man to wake up so he could lift the gates and allow traffic through. And understandably, that pissed people off. That pissed a lot of people off, and somebody ended up going to the police department with it. On other occasions, the man would fail to close the gates when he went to sleep, and trains would come and the gates wouldn't be down, and there would be cars crossing the gate, crossing the crossings with no warning that there were trains coming, and he would be asleep during all of it. Alonzo Sargent is not the only one guilty of going to sleep on the job in Gary, Indiana, as far as the railroad in 1918. This is an amazing place, man. I wouldn't want to live nowhere else. I love Gary. I love my region, man. Hey, look, leave your comments below, man. Like, share, and subscribe. Do all that bullshit. I don't care what you do. G.I. wear a fan.